Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Elastoplast tape-in and movement series. My name is Eddie Farah, and I'm the head physiotherapist with the South Sydney Rabbitohs, and also the owner and director of Redfern Physiotherapy and Sports Medicine, which is where we come to you from tonight. We're going to be talking about all things glutes today, but before we start the session, just make sure your microphone is on mute. I'm pretty sure most of our participants have done that, but just make sure that you're on mute. We plan to go for about 45 minutes and we'll leave the questions to the end. So if you have any questions, just type them into your chat box and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end of the session. For our session today, we're going to try, we're going to talk about a bit of a theory first before we move to some more practical assessment and rehabilitation strength exercises for our glute muscles. But with anything that we do, it's very important to understand the theory as to what we're looking at, why, and that gives us a basis for all our rehab. So when we talk about our glutes, obviously everyone knows where they are, and it's very important to remember and realise that they're not just talking about one muscle. Okay, it's very important to understand that. It's a whole group of muscles. They all have very different functions, although they're all working together at the same time to carry out those functions. We have muscles that work in the sagittal plane. So when we talk about the sagittal plane, it's flexion and extension of the hip. Okay, so muscles around the hip that control movement in that plane. Then we have muscles that control us in the coronal, or what we call the frontal plane, which is mainly abduction and adduction of the hip. And then last of all, in the transverse, or what we call the horizontal plane, which is internal rotation and external rotation of the hip. So they're the three major movements around our hip joint. And our glute muscles are largely responsible for controlling those movements, along with other muscles acting around the hip, like our groins, hip flexors, and a whole bunch of other muscles. But one of our primary drivers and central parts of controlling that area is the group of muscles referred to as our glutes. So if we break it down further, what are the main muscle groups that make up our glutes? Glute max, or gluteus maximus, is the biggest, bulkiest part of our glutes, and that's one of our main drivers. That mainly controls our flexion and extension movements. We've got our glute medius and glute minimus, which are on the lateral part, posterior lateral part of the hip. They're the main role is the lateral stability of the hips. They prevent us dropping into adduction and internal rotation of the hip. And we'll talk a little bit more about these movements and themes as we go through our presentation. And lastly, we've got the deep hip rotators. And their main role is to stabilise the hip joint. So hip is a ball and socket joint. Our deep hip rotators, whilst their important function is to control the rotation of the hip, one of their primary functions is to stabilise the ball in the socket, which then allows the glute max and the glute medius and minimus to work more efficiently and effectively. When we look at assessing and training these muscles, it's important to remember that no muscles work in isolation. They all work together around the hip and then also in conjunction with whole bunch of other muscles around our body. So, our low back muscles, our core muscles, they're all functioning together to produce the desired outcome. So I broke it down as far as groups of muscles controlling different movements, but it's important to recognise that they all play a role in controlling all movements around the hip, and they're working together to achieve that. So why do our glutes get weak? Okay, very common problem that we see in sport and in practice, people with weak glute muscles. So why do we see this so commonly? Big part is our activity and posture. Prolonged sitting throughout the day, which a lot of us in office jobs will spend a good part of our day sitting. This reduces the activation of our glute max, and over time these muscles become weak, they become atrophied, and they lose their tone and strength. Also, poor posture around the pelvis. If we have an anterior pelvic tilt, we have tightness in our hip flexors, tightness in our low back muscles, weakness through our core. That puts our glute muscles in a lengthened position, and they're not in an advantageous position to fire properly, and that will cause some weakness and inhibition of our glute max. There's also a lot of evidence to show that overactivity of our hip flexor muscles, muscle in front of our hip, directly inhibit our glutes. So if these are overactive, direct relationships inhibit our glute muscles from firing properly. And another very common thing that we see, weakness in glutes in reaction to pain or swelling. So pain is considered an inhibitor of the glute muscles, resulting in delayed and reduced activation. And this can be then associated with compensation, with low back muscles trying to take the load, or quite often our hamstrings. So inhibition of our glutes can be from local areas such as the low back or hip pain itself, but can also be related to pain away from our hip. So a classic example is someone has an ankle sprain, and our way of compensating for that is to take the load off that ankle, and that our body compensation to deload that particular side will cause reflex inhibition and wasting of our glute muscles. So quite commonly we see people coming back after an ankle injury or knee injury, they've lost the function of their glutes. So it's a compensation mechanism that our body naturally takes on to protect that injured body part. And then we quite often, in rehabilitating the knee or ankle, a common area that's missed is the actual glute muscle themselves. So what happens if our glutes are weak? Why is it so important that we strengthen them? For the glute maximus, if that's not firing properly, we lack the proper drive for our hip extension during walking and running. It also leads to a stooped posture, so in standing a more flexed posture through our hips. Also, while we're walking and running, we're in slight flexion in our hips because our glutes aren't firing properly to extend the hip. One of the biggest problems if we lose hip extension is compensation in the low back, which I mentioned earlier. Also overactivity and tightness through the hip flexors, and commonly overactive hamstrings. And it's been shown by multiple studies that low glute max recruitment during sprinting, anyone with poor recruitment is at a heightened risk of a hamstring muscle injury. So obviously with all athletes, that's something we need to prevent. If we've got weak glute medius and minimus muscles, as we mentioned earlier, they control your hips' lateral stability. So if they're weak, our hips quite often drop into adduction and internal rotation. And this can lead to so many problems at the knee, the foot, the low back, and right up through our thoracic spine and neck. Okay, so if our lateral hip stability is lost, there's got to be compensation somewhere else in the chain. And we quite often, these can present as different pathologies like adductor tendinopathy in the groin, hip joint impingement, patellofemoral pain in the knee, plantar fasciitis in the foot, and so many other different pathologies. And lastly, our deep hip external rotators. They externally rotate and stabilize the hip. I quite often like to refer to these muscles as the rotator cuff of the hip joint. So everyone's familiar with the rotator cuff in the shoulder, common site of injury in the shoulder, and they control the rotation stability of the shoulder joint. I like to think about deep hip stabilizers that have the same role. And if they're not firing properly to stabilize the hip, then our glute max and our glute medius are inhibited and they're not allowed to function properly. So that's a bit of theory and background. Okay, so we want to start to move towards assessing people's glute strength and then look at some rehab principles. Before we move into assessment though, I'd just like to recap some of the rehab principles that I discussed when I did my ankle presentation a couple of weeks ago. So a basic formula or system I like to work through when I'm rehabilitating any injury, I like to follow these steps. Number one is establishing normal mobility and range of motion. So if we have someone that's come into our clinic and we want to assess their glute strength, if they haven't got normal mobility around the hip joint first, there's no point trying to assess their glute strength. Okay, to have our glute firing properly, particularly our glute max, we want to work that into extension. If we're super tight through our anterior hip muscles, through our hip flexors and rectus femoris, that doesn't allow us that full hip extension, and then we aren't going to have the desired outcome of our rehab exercises. So establishing normal range of motion is the first and most important factor of any rehabilitation plan. Once we've established that normal range of motion, we can move on to our strengthening. That's where we're going to demonstrate a few exercises today. Once we've established good strength, we want to look at trying to build good control, using multi-directional exercises, incorporating the whole body to challenge our system in different ways. And then once we've achieved that, then we want to move towards dynamic and sport-specific strength and function. So they're the stages I work through with any injury, no matter what the joint is, whether it's an ankle or knee, hip or shoulder. We want to establish normal movement, then build strength, then control, and then power with sport-specific movement. So we're going to work through these, so stay with me. We're going to go through assessment and then suggest a variety of different rehab exercises to try and correct some of these postures. So to help me out today, I've got my partner Steve Losky here, who's been working on his glute strength for this presentation. So I hope he doesn't let us down. But as well as demonstrating good technique, I'm also going to show you some poor strategies and compensations that people adopt and things to look for, so then we can coach those patients or athletes to try and improve things in our rehabilitation program. So before we assess any athlete or any movement, we always want to just observe that person's posture in standing to see what their muscle bulk's like, see their alignment of their hips, their lumbar spine, just general posture around their body. Big one before we go into looking at hip strength is just assessing the bulk of their hips and their glute muscles. Okay, quite often we see people have absolutely no muscle tone around their hips or glutes because they're just not firing those muscles. So quite often that's a dead giveaway. Just by looking at that person, you can gain a fair bit of information. I like to look at them from the front and then from the side. So Steve turns to face the mirror, just assessing their alignment and their glute muscle bulk. Okay, looking for any excessive pelvic tilting, and a big one that I'm looking for is what we call the butt grippers. It's a common thing that we do see. People that grip with their deep glute muscles, so they've got weak glutes, they tend to grip with their deep hip muscles, and they're basically resting on the passive structures in their hip, and their glute max and glute med aren't firing at all. They've just locked their hip into extension, and they'll find these people are the hardest ones to rehabilitate. So Steve's not a good advocate for this because he's got quite good function around his hips. My advice would be to Google butt gripper. Once you've seen one, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And they're people that look like their butt is literally sucked in, and they're just hanging on for dear life. They're very hard to rehabilitate because their glutes are weak, but also they're just locked in, so they don't want to use their glutes at all. They're really hard to coach. So we're going to talk about some strategies as we move forward about how to identify a butt gripper and how to rehabilitate them more effectively. So after observation, the most basic and fundamental movement we want to assess is a squat. Okay, so I'm going to get Steve to do a few repeated squats here at a nice slow pace while I'm talking. Okay, I'm going to assess him from the front first and then from the side. So things we're going to look for: a basic alignment of the knees coming straight over the toes, and a common compensation that we see with a lot of people is knees dropping in. So they're losing control around their hips with their weak glutes, and knees will drop in as Steve has demonstrated there. Okay. Steve turns to the side now, facing the mirror, doing the same movement, nice and slow. What I want to see is the knees moving forward slightly over the toes, hips sinking into flexion, and nice straight posture through the spine, from lumbar spine right through the thoracic spine. Again, Steve just stops there for a moment. People I mentioned earlier, the butt grippers, that will just clench their butt, okay, and don't want to use their glutes at all. But Steve to try and do a squat now in this position, the knees come straight forward over the toes, and he won't release through his hips. His hips are locked. And he's going to flex through his spine, okay, and his knee will come forward over his toes, and he's not using his hip muscles at all. Okay, so they're the ones that we want to look for, people that are not using their hip muscles. But what we do want to see, Steve has his hands in front, is center of gravity staying right above the feet, flexing through the hips, straight spine, knees over toes, and weight going through his heels. Okay. Now, Steve turns the face away from us now. So after we've assessed a double leg squat, we want to assess a single leg stance and then a single leg squat. So he looked pretty good in double leg stance. We want to see what he's like in single leg. So you may or may not have heard of the Trendelenburg test. It's a basic test to just assess how Steve controls his pelvis in single leg stance. So I'm going to stand behind him. He's going to kneel down. What I do is put my hands over his iliac crests, okay, his big hip bones, both my thumbs on his dimple bones, just the back of his glutes, okay, the top of his glutes there. I'm going to ask Steve to go into left single leg balance, and I want to see my two thumbs stay level. Okay, let me see, that's perfect there from Steve. Both thumbs there are staying level, so he's stabilising quite well through his glute med on this left hip. So he comes down now. So that's what we want to see. An example of someone who's weak through their lateral stabilisers, Steve demonstrates now, we're going to see that drop. So my right hand and thumb drop, okay, and we can see he's lost his alignment. He's compensating by side bending up through his thoracic spine, and his knees dropping in, and he's getting wobbly now because he's lost his control. And stand up now, Steve. Another common compensation that we see, and again, this is probably more likely with our butt grippers, is rather than dropping that opposite hip, we'll see them hitch. So Steve shows an example of that now. Hitch. There we go. So Steve's my right thumb is expected to stay level. He's actually hitching this side up. So he's locking in his hip, okay? And he's hitching this side. We don't want to see that at all. We want to see this stay level. So if you relax down, want to see all that stay level, nice alignment right through his whole kinetic chain. Okay, relax there. So the next step to challenge our system even further, so as you can see, we're progressing from double leg to single leg, and now we're going to a single leg squat. So if we first observe Steve from behind, same thing I want to see. Steve goes into a single leg squat. Okay. Both my thumbs are staying level, and everything's staying in nice alignment right through his whole system. Now Steve turns to face the camera now. This is where our lateral hip stability really comes into play. And as well as having a feel from behind to see the level of his dimple bones, we want to look at his alignment from the front. And what we can see here more effectively is the position of his knee. I want to see his knee come straight over his toes. So Steve does a good demonstration for me now. Good control, good alignment, knees coming straight over his toes. Okay, so good effective glute control. Someone who's going to be poor in this situation, once again, will see their left hip drop and knee come into internal rotation. Can you see that there? Look at his position of his thigh, dropping right to adduction, internal rotation. And we'll see that quite obviously with someone with really weak glutes. Okay? Someone with really tight glutes, who's a butt gripper, we'll see that. I don't want to flex the hip at all. So Steve does that now. I don't want to flex the hip at all. His knee's going to shoot forward over his toes and he's going to have knee pain. So grip your butt and do a single leg squat, and his knees come right forwards over his toes. If you face the side and do that again, so really grip through this butt. So he's hitching that hip, and his knees shoot forward over his toes. A lot of strain going in his knees. If you do 3 or 4 of those yourself at home, you'll feel the pain in your knees straight away. So we don't want to see that. Okay, so he's not using his glutes there at all. Okay, so there are functional movements. Okay, so you can usually identify someone who's moving poorly with those basic tests. Okay, extending beyond that though, if we want to break it down a little bit further, we get them into a supine bridge. So I ask Steve to come onto his back. No, just feet on the mat first, Steve. How are we going there? Let the center of the camera. Beautiful. And come on this side here. So Steve in this position here is going to do a glute bridge. Now I'm sure you're familiar with the glute bridge. The one thing we quite often miss are the little cues of how to coach this and train this more effectively and efficiently. So I still see this quite commonly with inexperienced trainers or physios. Try and pick up the little subtleties of how we can train this exercise much better. So I'll give you a few cues of things we're looking for. So if I ask Steve to come up into a double leg bridge, okay, what we're looking for is good alignment from the knee to the hip to the shoulder. Straight line, good, effective glute activation will allow Steve to get that straight line through that whole chain. If he has weak glutes, drop down Steve, and can't quite get that full hip extension, okay, you're going to see a slight little V. We don't want to see that full hip extension. Come down Steve, because I know you're going to get pretty tired there. All right, and the other thing we don't want to, the other thing we need to be sure of, as I mentioned earlier, Steve's got full range in his hip flexors. So Steve comes up, his limiting factor might be tightness through the anterior hip, not allowing him to have a full extension. Okay, so come right up, Steve. Now we know Steve hasn't got that issue, he's getting full extension. Okay, so very important to make sure through our different assessment techniques, which I won't go into today, that they've got at least neutral hip range of motion. Okay, Steve comes down again. Now, quite common compensations that we see with this simple test. Steve comes up again. Quite often people will hinge and arch their back and fire their back muscles. So Steve going into extension there. Okay, that's going to cause pain and discomfort through the back muscles straight away. So we don't want to feel that. We need to coach them to keep their core muscles on, get their spine in neutral, get the hip extension through their hip and not their low back. Relax down, Steve, have a short rest. The other common compensation is hamstrings. Okay, they'll be firing to try and get their full hip extension. So Steve comes up again, and glutes aren't really firing, he's going to feel cramping in his hamstrings. So if any of your clients feel cramping in their hamstrings, it's because they're recruiting the hamstrings first and not the glutes. So it's important to coach them on how to fire those glutes better. Let's relax down. A couple of simple techniques. Might be simply to bend their knees a little bit further. So if we're doing a glute bridge with their feet out here, they might tend to fire their hamstrings more. The more we flex the knees, puts the hamstring in a short position and doesn't allow them to fire properly. Therefore, they have to use the glute muscles more.
Okay, that's one simple trick. Another one is to just cue them and coach them to fire their glutes by pushing through their heels. So if I tell Steve to come up, drive your heels down into the ground, lift by pushing through your heels, that's a simple cue to help him fire his glutes better. So that's quite a simple one that you can cue someone with to try and get their glute activation. Okay, and we'll go through a few more strategies when we get into our training principles. All right, so also one other thing I want to check, if we have an athlete with us and they can do that quite easily, we want to work them to fatigue. So doing 1 or 2 or 3 reps might not be enough to see any weakness or compensation. They might have Steve do 10, 15 or 20 of those double leg bridges. Okay. And then also to challenge them even further, we progress to a single leg, which is a hell of a lot harder. So if I ask Steve to do a single leg now, okay, it requires a hell of a lot more glute activation. Same thing, looking for that good alignment, making sure he's firing his glutes, not his hamstrings. And the big one I'm looking for with this exercise is that his hips and pelvis are staying neutral, so he's not rotating. But what I quite often do here is get a stick, a broomstick, or anything that you have laying around. We're going to lay that across his pelvis, and that his pelvis should stay level. So as he comes up into a bridge, we don't want to see any rotation through his pelvis. So if Steve does that poorly, okay, and loses control, okay, he may drop into rotation into this direction, but quite commonly, his opposite hip will drop. So if Steve comes up, and we'll see this stick rotate. Okay, I want to see it stay level. That's very, very important. Again, if his glutes aren't firing properly, he'll start recruiting other muscles around the hip, like his deep rotators, his TFL, and we'll lose that control around the pelvis, and he'll go into rotation. We don't want to see that. All right. Steve, can you get you on your side? We're not going to do 4-point kneeling today. You're straight onto your side. So we assessed his glute max into hip extension. Next thing we want to do, behind Steve here. I'm going to get him to flex. Yep, both knees up. Okay. I'm going to straighten out his top leg as it drops down into slight adduction. So here we're going to test his lateral hip stability and strength. So his glute med and glute minimus predominantly. But again, just recapping, all our glute muscles work together. So even in this position, our glute max is going to be firing and our deep rotators. But the main movement we're biasing here is our lateral hip abduction, which is going to predominantly be recruit our glute med and glute min to achieve that movement. So simple test once again, but a few cues I want to coach you on today to make sure we're doing this exercise effectively. First and foremost, getting our client or patient in the right position. We can see you've got the bottom leg flexed and this leg on the ground. What's really important is good alignment through the whole body. Okay, so Steve's spine is in neutral. It's not flexed. It's not extended. He's in a good position. Okay. Now, as I get Steve to lift that leg up into abduction, we're not going to come right up that high. Okay, just 15 to 20 degrees of abduction, and control that up and down, Steve. Keep going for about 10 reps. We'll be nice and slow. So we don't want to hit the ground and relax at the bottom. It's continuous. I want to look at Steve's alignment and posture. A couple of common compensations is side bending, using your obliques to try and get that movement. Steve will side bend and hitch through his pelvis. You can see he's demonstrating that now. We don't want to see that side bend through his oblique muscles and his rib cage. When it's that stay neutral and his hip to stay neutral. Now, common compensation that we see is people start to flex their leg forwards to use their TFL muscle, one of the anterior hip muscles, to try and achieve that abduction. We don't want to see that. We want to keep the hip in extension and the pelvis in neutral to try and bias the glute medius and glute minimus muscle. Okay, so that's a common compensation. Hip into flexion. And another one that we commonly see is they'll rotate backwards. Okay, so as they rotate backwards, same thing again. They're using these anterior hip muscles to try and achieve that movement. As Steve works into fatigue, and I might get to 10, 15, 20 reps, depending on his level of activity, I want to make sure he's maintaining good alignment. So keep going, Steve. His hip's not coming into flexion, no side bending, and he should feel the burn right through his lateral part of the hip. So I'm looking at the quality of the movement. I make sure his leg's not shaking, and I'll see what level he fatigues at. And a good basic assessment is see how they compare to the other side. You can do 15 to 20 reps on this side comfortably, but on this other side, he's burning out at 8 reps and he's starting to lose control. Well, then we know we've got a deficiency on one side. That's a very simple and basic test. Okay, but once again, coaching good alignment, using the right muscles is crucial. All right, now progression of that, what I like to quite often assess, Steve straightens his legs out, then go into a side plank, and this is a progression of our lateral hip stability. I want to get him to come up into a side plank And once again, I want to see his ability to maintain this position with good alignment, no rotation, hips are staying in extension. Okay. And to challenge him even further, I can ask him to lift his top leg, which puts more load on that hip. You see he's starting to shake now. It's a lot more challenging to his system. You can relax there. So once we challenge the system more, we'll see Steve rotate or lose control of his pelvis. Okay. Obviously, that's starting to incorporate the whole body, shoulder strength through his core. But I find it's a good general test to assess someone's lateral hip strength. All right, thanks, Steve. Stay in there. Okay, we're going to go into a clam exercise. So I'm sure everyone's heard of the clam exercise. Very basic, simple exercise, very similar to the hip abduction. But to assess this properly, it's once again important to have good hip alignment. Okay, so we're assessing the strength of the deep hip rotators and the glute med to abduct and externally rotate the hip. I like to have the knees in 90 degrees, spine once again in neutral. And what I like to do is ask them to gently turn their feet out, press their heels together. And that helps us to activate our deep hip stabilizers more. And I'll Steve just go into a gentle opening of the hip, up and down. Again, once again, a common thing I see people come right up here and then start to lose their alignment and control. Just coming to slightly above the horizontal is enough range there to work through. So he's going to maintain that gentle pressure through his heels. And again, I'm assessing the quality of his movement, make sure it's a nice, smooth, controlled movement, and I'm going to work him to fatigue, and I'm going to compare it to his other side. Once again, should be feeling that through the posterior glute muscles, glute med, deep hip rotators. And once again, I'm assessing to make sure his spine can stay neutral and he's not going to start to rotate his pelvis. If Steve is feeling through the front of his hip, once again, we know that he's compensating and firing his TFL muscle, which is a very common compensation, which locks the hip, and we don't want to see that with any of our clients. Okay, moving on from there, that's enough of our assessment as far as demonstration, but other things I just want to talk about is making sure that's our basic assessment, but what we want to do is see all these things transfer into our everyday tasks. So you might want to assess someone walking, look what their glute controls like and their hip extensions like when they're walking. You might assess them during hopping and landing. If they're an athlete that requires those movements, you might assess them in a lunge. Sprinting, we might videotape them sprinting, then assess their movement quality while they're running. There's a whole endless array of possibilities when we come into assessment. That's just a very simple breakdown of the things we're looking for, common compensation strategies. But as the tasks get more challenging, we need to make sure we're assessing how well they're firing their glutes in all those tasks and how well they're controlling their hip movement. So again, basic rundown, but you need to also apply that to more strenuous activities such as hopping, landing, running, all those sorts of things. All right, how are we going for time here? Beautiful, on track. So, rehab principles. I'm going to go have a quick drink of water, and we're going to talk a little bit about rehab principles before we go into some exercises and demonstrate some glute exercises. Thanks, Steve. Okay. So some principles of rehab I'm going to discuss just for a few minutes. So all the exercises we're going to go through are pretty much going to be progressions in those streams of assessment that we just discussed. Any rehab exercise or any rehab program needs to be specific to that particular individual. It needs to be specific with respect to their age, their size, their gender, their injury history, their training history, their sport, their occupation. Every single person we see is different. They present differently with different problems. We need to assess the individual, assess how they move, figure what their problem is, and then coach and train that problem. Again, as I mentioned in my last talk, never like the cookie cutter approach. It's never as simple as someone comes in with weak glutes, do this exercise, you're going to fix them. There's lots of different presentations. Sometimes you've got people that are butt grippers as opposed to people that are just really weak and floppy and drop into hip adduction and internal rotation. So there's lots of different people. We need to tailor our programs to those individuals. And that's, if you take nothing out of today, that basic rehab principle is something that I always follow. And that will serve you well if you just keep that in mind anytime you're designing a rehab program. Strengthening of any muscle group requires careful planning and well-designed progressions from less challenging to more challenging. We're going to show you how we can do that. We need to balance the use of low load to failure. So using stuff like a clam exercise to failure or basic hip adduction to failure with high load resistance training, whereas that might be a squat with a barbell, a weighted barbell. So, you're doing your 5 RM max or 85% of your 1 RM max. Loaded exercise to try and build strength. So you need a variety of different types of exercises.
And this is most important to provide all-round neuromuscular optimization. Our starting point is different for every individual. As I mentioned, if someone's really, really weak, we might need to start them with their non-weight bearing exercises on the ground or on exercise mat. Okay. Our non-weight bearing exercises have strengths and weaknesses. We're going to talk a little bit about those. The main weaknesses includes a lack of specificity and transference to functional exercises and movements, as well as being time inefficient. So a body of time devoted to just one specific muscle group as opposed to targeting multiple muscle groups as part of one exercise. So it's not very time efficient. But the strength of it is that it does allow exercises that can target a specific muscle group in isolation, which can be highly effective in the presence of specific muscle weakness or specific muscle inhibition, and very importantly, in a load compromised athlete. So during an early period of rehabilitation after an injury. So if we have someone that's coming with an ankle injury, as I mentioned earlier, quite often we'll see someone 6 weeks later to rehabilitate their ankle, and you see they've lost control in their glutes. So what we quite often do, as early as possible, even if someone's in a walking boot and they're weight bearing, we can start them doing non-weight bearing exercises. When we say non-weight bearing, obviously there's going to be some weight going through the foot, but we mean not in standing, on the ground. We can start them on those exercises very early in their rehabilitation to maintain and build their glute strength. So that's the advantage of our mat exercises. In those patients with severe dysfunction and limited strength capacity, a greater focus on corrective exercises may be needed before the muscle can be strengthened and trained to work optimally in those functional tasks like squat and single leg squat, etc. These non-weight bearing exercises serve as an effective pre-activation stimulus. This corrective program should begin with non-weight bearing exercises to develop the strength capacity of the muscle, whilst also addressing other factors causing its inhibition, such as I mentioned, potential hip flexor tightness, weak core muscles, tightness in the rectus spine muscles in the low back. So we need to address those factors as well as part of that initial program. From there, we can use bands, resistance bands, which we're going to demonstrate shortly. Use of bands can support elevated glute activation for both non-weight bearing and weight bearing exercises. It's been shown that performing a bilateral squat with a band around the knee can elevate activation of the glute max and the glute medius. And Steve's going to demonstrate that for us shortly. The added resistance will force increased activation of glute muscles to prevent adduction and or internal rotation of the femur. So once again, that hip and knee dropping in, the internal rotation. It also acts as a cue to train control of the limb and avoid dynamic knee valgus in functional movement tasks. As well as activating the glutes to fire better, okay, it will provide a cue to pull that knee out so it's not dropping into internal rotation and adduction. Weight bearing or functional exercises such as single leg squats, lunges, deadlifts, or a whole bunch of other exercises can produce higher levels of activation than isolated exercises such as the clams, and therefore are more effective for strength training. So we're going to go into some demonstration of some exercises and progressions in all those streams. But it's just important to remember that it is impossible in the next 10 minutes to cover every single rehabbing glute strengthening exercise. We're going to just, again, show you a few examples in each stream, but there's a whole array of exercises out there that you can utilize. As I mentioned in my previous talk, the internet, Instagram, YouTube, there's some great examples of a whole variety of different exercises to get different muscles firing. But if you just always make sure you're adhering to the principles of coaching them to use the right muscles with the right technique and the right alignment, you can't go wrong. Let's get into it. Steve. So, I'm going to go right back to it. Start with our non-weight bearing exercise on the floor. All right. So, talk about coaching him to use the right muscles, firing his glutes, not using his back extensors or his hamstrings, making sure when he goes into single leg, he's not dropping his hips. Now, a couple of simple progressions, very basic. So, Steve can start with his hands on the floor and go into a bridge. It's going to be a lot easier. Want to add load, cross his arms on his chest. Okay, slight difference in load. Next progression, put his hands in the air, which requires a bit more control and stability through his shoulders and thoracic spine. This is a starting point for everyone. This is a basic starting level of simple progressions. Okay, other progressions. Feet up on a bench. Okay, so from that basic starting point,
We can go feet up on a bench, a bit more load is going to go through the glutes once Steve come right up into full extension. You can hold that position, and you can alternate by lifting one leg up and the other, making sure he's not dropping. It's a very challenging task. You need to maintain full hip extension and firing activation of that glute, and alternate the load going through each leg. If someone can't stabilise and have full extension of the hip doing this exercise, then they need to go back a level. Okay, come back, Steve. A further progression of that is our Swiss ball. Thank you. So Steve, slide back. Similar exercise, but providing a bit more challenge to the system by using a Swiss ball. Steve's going to press up and maintain control. Make sure the ball's not going to roll out from under him. It requires a hell of a lot more control to maintain that hip extension. Okay. Other progressions, if I get Steve to stand up, is having his shoulder blades and back resting on the Swiss ball. Okay. So again, once again, Steve comes up in the full hip extension. Okay. And we can hold there, alternate one leg up in the air and down. So let's come up in the full hip extension. Yep, let's maintain that position. Yep, it's a very challenging exercise. So you've got to maintain control through his whole system, making sure he's not rolling off the ball, maintaining full hip extension. Not an easy exercise. So someone quite advanced, we can progress to maintain this. And Steve's done a pretty good job, I'd say. Almost a pass. All right. Okay, other progressions. Then, out of the way. Steve, can you put down here again? Using our mini bands, quite effective. Steve's going to put that over his knees, or giving us resistance in a whole bunch of different tasks. Great for training the glutes. Okay, so Steve's going to come back. Same thing, going to come up into full hip extension. Now, Steve's just going to put a little bit, open his knees slightly to maintain a bit of tension in that band, providing some resistance. Now, that's providing a force to internally rotate his hips. By having to abduct and externally rotate his hips, it's getting him fire his glute muscles a hell of a lot more. It's firing his glute med, and deep hip rotators, and his glute max to get that last bit of hip extension. Okay, relax down. If someone was a butt gripper, I wouldn't give them this exercise at all, because that's going to encourage them to fire their muscles that are already locked up and grabbing on for dear life. Okay, so anyone that's a butt gripper, I wouldn't have them doing this exercise at all. A very minimal band work around their knees. They need to be coached to relax their hip muscles and fire them in a different way, which we'll go through a couple of examples a little bit later. But mini band around the knee, great exercise. Anyone that drops into hip adduction, internal rotation. So just put a bit of tension on the band by opening the knees, will help them fire your glutes a lot better. Okay, so do a few reps first, Steve. And down. Brilliant. And we can even make this even more challenging by getting Steve to come up into full hip extension. He's going to extend one leg out. Okay. And then the other leg. Try and maintain full hip extension and some tension on the band. Okay, another great little progression there. All right. Okay, can you take that off? Another really good exercise is a hip thrust, which is basically, we've demonstrated that in a number of different ways. But a hip thrust is a great exercise. A couple of studies have been done on hip thrust which show that actually fires your glutes a lot more than a squat. So an exercise we quite often have our athletes doing is shoulders will be on a bench. Okay, so if we grab a bench over here, hip thrust exercise, we have a weighted barbell over Steve's hips, okay, and he's going to come up in a full hip extension. All right, so we can load this up with weight across hip and pelvis in a full hip extension. And this, as I mentioned, has been shown to fire the glute max actually more than a loaded squat. And great exercise for someone who can't do a squat because of low back injury or any other injury. Very effective exercise. So I want to make sure we go on this. Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. All right, moving through. Sideline hip abduction. So Steve comes onto his side and put that over the knees. So again, mini bands are great, provide resistance for all our movements. As I mentioned earlier, we can work to fatigue with a lot of these movements, just anti-gravity. But someone that's quite strong, we can challenge them a lot more with bands around knees, or if we want to make it more challenging around his ankles. So once again, Steve's going to come up into hip abduction, looking for good alignment, as I mentioned before, not rotating, not side bending, and he's feeling that burn through his glute med and glute min. Okay, making sure his hip stays in full extension. Okay, again, make sure they're not tight through the anterior hip muscles so they can achieve that full extension. And we can work this to fatigue. To make it a little bit harder, we can pop that band down around his ankles or feet. So longer lever, this can provide a lot more resistance. Okay, he comes down, his head's already a bit more challenging. Steve having to compensate by side bending slightly, and may not show up well on the camera, but it's starting to shake a little bit, so it's a hell of a lot harder. All right, brilliant. Okay, so let's pop that around your knees again, Steve. We mentioned our clam exercise earlier. Again, resistance band for our clam exercise, very effective and will help to fire those glutes. You'll feel a burn after 6 to 8 reps if you're using the right muscles. Very good exercise. One thing I always coach is make sure you're not relaxing at the bottom. Don't let the knees touch. Don't completely switch those muscles off. Okay, I want to see them switch on and off. I want to keep them firing the whole way up and down. Okay, so again, gentle pressure through the heels, feet top slightly turned out. Steve continues to do a clam there. How are those glutes going? You all right? Okay. A little progression I like with this exercise is maintaining the side plank whilst doing the clam. So Steve's going to come up, maintain good alignment through shoulder, spine, pelvis, everything's in neutral. So recruiting both sides now. Right hip's got to maintain that lateral hip stability as he does a clam on this leg. So very good challenging exercise. Okay. Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. All right. Now keep that around your knees. Stand up for us, facing the camera there. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, mini bands around the knees are great for coaching the squat. They help us to fire our glutes a hell of a lot better and also provide a stimulus to coach us to not drop into internal rotation, as I mentioned earlier. So Steve's going to stand with his feet slightly wider than his shoulders, hands out in front. Okay, and he's going to go into a squat as he pushes his knees out over his toes and tensions the band. Okay, he's getting a lot more activation and fatigue through those glutes. A couple of very simple progressions. Steve goes down and holds. Okay, another thing I coach to make sure they're firing their glutes better is make sure the weight's going through their heels. If their weight's shifting towards their toes, quite often means they're using their quad muscles more, knees are coming forward over their toes, and they're feeling the weight go through their toes, and their quads are burning more than their glutes. A simple technique, coach your athletes to keep the weight through their heels. So Steve comes down, again, fire the glutes, keep the tension on that band, again, to hold that position. Come right down, then open up one hip. So the left hip has to stabilise, the right hip opens up and in. So we're starting to work almost that external rotation movement that we're doing with the clam. Hip external rotation abduction. To fire those lateral hip muscles as he maintains that squat. We can go 5 each leg, 10 each leg if they're quite strong, got good endurance. We can use stronger bands as a progression. Okay, so a nice simple exercise I like to use to get a good burn and strengthening through their glutes. All right. Other little progressions. Steve will do banded walks. So Steve just starts from back near the wall there. He'll crab walk forward with a band around his knees, maintain a good squat position, sinking back through his hips, good alignment through his spine. Okay. Another good exercise, walking backwards. And then turn to face the mirror. Be holding, maintain that position, crab walking sideways. Again, maintaining good squat position, good alignment, so it's challenging the system in different ways. And back in the other direction. We can also do this in full upright standing. Okay. Really gets those lateral hip muscles burning. Progression from that is having 2 bands, one around the feet and one around the knees. So Steve takes the yellow band off. Take that off. The green one's tighter, so we'll put that around the knees. He's going to put the mini band around his feet. So that puts it around his feet. He has to externally rotate his feet, which will get his external rotators in his hips firing a hell of a lot more. So if you face the screen, Steve, you can crab walk forwards with double resistance there. We're really going to get your glutes burning pretty quick. Okay, and we do that laterally as well. All right. Brilliant. Okay, let's take those bands off, Steve. Actually, just leave the green one on. So a lot of double leg stability there, squatting with resistance. Obviously, once again, want to progress to single leg. So if he's
double leg squat technique was strong and effective, but he's poor in single leg stance and single leg squat. That's something we want to train and coach. Once again, coaching on good alignment, good position through his spine, good activation of the glutes, and bands that once again provide resistance. The exercise that I like was Steve going to single leg stance with slight flexion through his hip and knee. Slight flexion through his hip and knee, so getting the glutes on in this position. Me onto the right leg. Okay. You've got to maintain good alignment through his spine, stability through his hip, make sure his knee's not dropping into a rotation as he opens up the opposite leg. Very simple and effective exercise to control that lateral hip stability. Okay. A couple other different exercises. Can you take that off, Steve? Put a band around your foot. Again, to challenge our lateral hip stability. Band around his foot, in his face. His ankle. No, around your ankle, sorry, Steve. Going to go into hip abduction. So single leg stance, try to maintain good alignment through his stance leg. So left stance leg, left leg stance, yep. You're going to hip abduction. So straight leg. So just face that direction there for me. So you're going to maintain good alignment and stability on his left leg. Taking that right leg out into abduction, making sure he's not leaning to the side. So just to maintain good alignment and posture and stability through his hip as he takes that opposite leg into slight abduction. And you'll feel that burning through that lateral hip. Okay, take that off for me. Let's grab the Swiss ball again. Another one of my favourites. I might just quickly demonstrate this one. I think Steve's glutes are burning at the moment, starting to lose control. So one of my favourite exercises. Swiss ball, we can easily use a soccer ball if you have nothing else at home, or a netball, basketball. Swiss balls are quite effective. And I have that ball up against the wall, and I'm with my left knee, I'm going to stand on my right leg with my left knee, coming straight out in front and hold that ball against the wall. By applying a gentle pressure of that ball into the wall, this right leg's having to work hard to stabilise his hip to prevent me from rotating. Okay, by pushing that ball into the wall, my body wants to rotate in that direction. Okay, so I'm going into internal rotation of the hip by putting pressure on that ball gently and maintaining good alignment of this right hip. I'm going to feel that burn. I can feel that already. I want to hold that for 30, 45 seconds. That's a very good starting point. If you have no bands at home, any ball up against the wall, maintain pressure there. It's a good place to start. From there, we can hold that and go into a gentle single leg squat. So I have to maintain firing those glute muscles as I sink into a single leg squat. Okay. Again, our butt grippers are going to want to flex their knee over their toes. I'm not flexing my hip there at all. Okay, so any exercise requires good coaching to teach the right alignment and technique. Spine is staying straight as I'm working through a little quarter squat. Okay, and I'm feeling that burn through there. So that's one of my favourites there, and quite a simple exercise. Moving on from there, functional exercises. So there are a few exercises in those streams that we spoke about, as far as double leg squat, single leg squat, and as I mentioned, there's a whole bunch of other progressions we can work through. Pretty quickly, I want to move to functional exercises. Okay, the most common and typically adopted weight-bearing exercises for the glutes include squats, deadlifts, step-ups, lunge, a whole bunch of other variations. You know, split squat, Bulgarian split squats, Romanian deadlift, lateral step-ups. We're not going to cover all of them today. There's a whole bunch of different functional exercises that we want to go through. Okay, and any progression of that basic squat step up needs to then incorporate some of those more functional movements. We'll go through a couple real quick. A lunge. So Steve comes back again. So we want to coach a good lunge. Okay, so Steve goes into right foot forward lunge. All our principles we need to adhere to. So again, knees over the toes. Make sure weight's going through this front heel. Does not put too much pressure forward over his toes. So he goes down to a lunge. Bring that back slightly. Good. So, okay, now if you turn and face the camera, same thing here, does the same movement. Want to make sure there's good alignment of the hip and pelvis, knees coming straight over his toes, and there's no dropping in of his knee and hip. Okay, good alignment of the spine, back staying straight. Okay, we can add load with dumbbells. Steve holds a couple of dumbbells. Okay, make it a bit more challenging. Face the mirror now for me. One thing we want to really see once you start to add load is you're not losing control through here. So quite often we see people flex. So Steve does an example of
start rounding their shoulders. Okay, to maintain good posture, good strength through his thoracic muscles. If you can't maintain that, then I wouldn't be doing this exercise. Okay, so strength through here to hold the dumbbells to be able to maintain good posture and therefore have his glutes firing properly without injuring himself. So that's a couple of simple little tips. You can also do that with a barbell on your shoulders, again, to load that exercise up further. Another progression I like, I'll just demonstrate. If someone does tend to drop into internal rotation in lunge position, I like to get a power band around their knee, attached to a wall. So that band is wanting to pull my knee, drop it in towards internal rotation and adduction. So my glutes have to work harder to pull my hip out. If I try and turn and face the camera to demonstrate that a bit better, okay, the band's wanting to pull me in, I have to pull out as I'm doing a lunge with the right technique. So it's cueing me to pull my knee out, and it's also making me fire those glutes a hell of a lot better. So that's a very simple exercise to try and achieve correct alignment during a lunge. Another slight progression that I like is to maintain that good position and open the knee up, let it drop in. So it's almost like a clamshell exercise in a functional strengthening position. Make sure the weight stays on the front leg, the weight's through the front heel, so your glutes are firing, and you should feel that burn. Okay? We don't want to feel any tightness or compression through our anterior hip. That means our quads and our TFL firing to compensate. We want to feel the weight going all through our glutes. Okay, so it's a nice simple exercise I like to use. Step ups. Once again, probably progression of our squats and single leg squat is a good effective step up. So once again, coaching that with good technique, good alignment, straight spine, being able to step up and extend through that hip. Okay, progressions of that, once again, holding dumbbells, holding the barbell, and coaching good technique. A couple of little simple tips. Once again, power band around the knee. Same sort of principle with the lunge. It's trying to maintain good alignment, not letting that knee drop in as we come into a step up. Okay, and we can make that resistance as tight or as hard as we want by using stronger bands or moving further away from the wall so there's more resistance. Another one that I really like is put that band around my hips. Okay, now that band wanting to make me tilt into side flexion, so I've got to maintain good strength through my core, good lateral hip stability. Step up. Sorry, I'll use a band that's attached up higher for this exercise. That's staying level with my waist and my hips. So that's around my waist there, wanting to pull me into a side bend. I've got to maintain good control through my lateral hip, maintain good alignment as I stand up and come into full hip extension. And then controlling it down. All right. So there's some handy little tips there. How are we going for time? We're going way over time. I was going to talk a bit further about challenging the whole body and the whole system, then progressing on to sport-specific movements. But I think we're going to run out of time, so I'll just quickly breeze through it. But it's important to start to incorporate multi-directional movements, different challenges to our system, then increasing speed and reaction forces, so hopping, landing, cutting manoeuvres, making sure we're coaching the right technique with those manoeuvres so that we're preventing further injury is really important. So if you remember walking through the stages of our rehab principles, we've gone through our strengthening, we're starting to build control through multi-directional movements, and then we want to go to faster, more sport-specific movements. So I won't have time to demonstrate a few of those. But just to give you a couple of examples of starting to incorporate a whole bunch of different functional tasks, I'll give 3 or 4 different examples of other ways we can challenge our system. Deadlifts is a very common exercise in single leg RDLs for glute strength in the rehab. So I'll get a kettlebell in one hand, left leg, single leg remaining deadlift. So my body's wanting to rotate. Okay, that kettlebell's wanting to make me twist, but my glute has to work harder to control that rotation. So we're starting to incorporate hip extension and rotation control. That's one exercise I like. Starting to incorporate other things like a reverse lunge with an overhead press. So starting to incorporate the whole kinetic chain, the whole body, maintaining good core stability, good alignment through the shoulders as we do a reverse lunge with good technique, firing those glutes. There are a couple of examples. Another one I really like is holding a power band or any sort of band out in front. That's going to want to cause rotation, a bit similar to around my waist, but a more challenging exercise. Doing a step up, maintaining that hand straight out in front to resist that rotation. Other anti-rotation exercises are getting a Swiss ball, a med ball. If we're going to go into a lunge with a twist and control, making sure we're not losing our hip control. We do a forward walking lunge, maintaining good alignment. There's a whole bunch of variations from that, which we'll quite often use with our athletes and challenge them in different ways. Always trying to keep in mind making it sport specific. I'll give a different exercise to a dancer as opposed to a rugby league player, as opposed to a marathon runner. So it's always important to tailor your program to that individual. Get creative. Work with the different equipment that you have, whether it be kettlebells, power bands, or Swiss balls, and trying to achieve the desired outcome. I'm out of breath after that. That's all done for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, fire away and I'll do my best to answer. See how we go.
Okay. I think we've run out of time, so I think people are going to send questions through via email to Elastoplast, and I'll do my best to get back to you guys in due course. So thanks very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something today, and best of luck.